Getting hurt was the last thing on my mind when we arrived in Afghanistan. I was excited and looking forward to the tour of my life. I wasn't going to be the one getting injured. If it came to it, I was going to be the one doing the injuring. I was totally prepared for it because I was getting what I wanted. Frontline action. After 6 years with the Marines, I was deploying as a grav at last. Thanks to something called the Direct Specialisation Scheme, where you're basically forced to specialise right out of training and told what you're going to specialise in, my background had been with Motor Transport Troop, MT. Driving and maintaining all different kinds of military and civilian vehicles. I wanted action, not to spend 6 months in the rear around Camp Bastion fixing up trucks and working on my tan. I had already requested a transfer to specialise as a grav in the UK, but thought there was no way it would be processed in time for my deployment to Afghan. As it turned out, my unit, 40 Commando Royal Marines, were short of gravs because there was so much to do, and they were pinging blokes from all over the unit to tour as infantry whether they requested it or not. That suited me fine. I just saw it as a shortcut that did away with the formal transfer. I had toured the world with MT and had a brilliant time, but in my mind, nothing could match this tour. This was going to be proper war fighting. The tales coming back from Afghan were electrifying. Lads were going into battle, bayonets fixed at company strength. Mortar teams and artillery were putting down more live rounds in a month than some had fired in their whole careers. This was the real thing. The Taliban were ferocious and fanatical. Unlike the Iraqi insurgents, they loved a good scrap and were prepared to stand and fight like a proper enemy. They weren't idiots either. Some of our blokes had been pretty impressed watching them fire and manoeuvre during contacts. The enemy had received some fairly decent training, and they weren't afraid to put it to use. You had to respect the fact that they were prepared to go toe-to-toe with us, and I couldn't wait to have a crack at them. It was going to be the ultimate test. We had trained for our entire professional lives, and I wanted to find out what was bullshit and what was real. Would I be any good at it? I was a pretty good soldier in exercise, but no man can predict how him and his mates are going to behave under fire. I wanted to know the answers. We knew that people could get hurt or even killed. There were enough reminders that something could happen at any moment before we even got off the plane. When the TriStar started its approach to Kandahar airfield, a buzz went around the aircraft. The new lads were all excited and couldn't wait to get stuck in. Some of the older blokes, or the younger ones on their second tours, were quieter. They were thinking about the realities, whereas to me, it was just a big adventure. I didn't give it a second thought when we were ordered to dig out our body armour and helmets from the overhead lockers and put them on for the landing, just in case the Taliban had a crack at the aircraft during the final approach or as it taxied in after landing. The TriStars have a suite of defensive countermeasures, including flares to decoy heat-seeking missiles while in the air. The threat on the ground is from mortars or rocket attacks into the base. If rounds or shrapnel started coming in through the aircraft, you would just have to trust in good luck and good body armour. It hadn't happened yet, and no one really believed it would. Or at least, not while they were on the plane it wouldn't. If you started thinking like that, you'd never get out of bed. And anyway, it's never going to happen to you, is it? You're strapped into your seat and there's no action you can take to improve your chances. So there's no point worrying about it. The plane bumped down onto the tarmac and taxied over to its hard standing with no drama. As the 3 big turbines wound down, there was another reminder about coming under attack. "This is the Air Movements Officer," said one of the RAF cabin crew over the speaker system. He was wearing a sandy, pink, all-in-one jumpsuit the crabs like to dress up in. "Your actions on, in the event of a rocket or mortar attack, on leaving the aircraft are as follows." And he told us what to do if any indirect fire started coming in as we walked away from the jet. On another flight, the officer in charge said, "Please follow the directions of the Air Movement staff, and bear in mind that due to the lack of hardened accommodation, this may simply involve lying down." That got a few wry laughs. Welcome to Afghanistan, I thought to myself. We gathered up the rest of the gear from the battered overhead lockers. These planes were 10 years old when the RAF bought them in 1980, and it showed. The interiors had been flogged around the world for almost 40 years. Some of these lockers would do you an injury if you don't watch it. We walked down the steps of the plane. It was the 8th of September 2007, my first day of a 6-month tour in country. I was 24 years old and had no idea what to expect. I just hoped it would be exciting. We walked across the tarmac and loaded ourselves onto a shitty little bus. It was honking, covered in dust inside and out. The seats were like sandpits. The bus growled off the runway and onto the dirt track. Clouds of mega fine clay powder came billowing in the windows and stuck to our skin and clothing. We were only doing about 10 miles an hour. We thought we were going to choke before we even got to arrivals. The windows were caked with dust, but I could just about see on one side of the track a chain-linked fence. Beyond it were a load of stunted trees in hardened clay, throwing ghostly shadows into the moonlight. The ground was potholed and uncultivated. What a shithole. The other side of the track was walled with Hesco, galvanised steel mesh formed into a cube about 4 feet square, containing a big polymer bag that's packed with sand and gravel. The engineers line them up in grids and fill them 2 at a time with a bulldozer. Then, some poor sprog has to level them off with a spade by hand. You stack them in pyramids, 2 or 3 high, and then top them off with razor wire to make a ballistic and bomb-proof perimeter wall. They can be used to make bunkers or to give blast protection to anything that needs it. They come flat-packed from a company in America for the engineers to set up. There are thousands and thousands of them in Afghanistan and Iraq, sitting on hundreds of miles of NATO perimeter. We would see them everywhere we turned, unless we were out on a patrol. The bus bumped off the track onto a graded hardcore surface and dropped us at the arrivals area. There were about 40 lads from our unit, and we were all about to be scattered across southern Afghanistan to plug the gaps as needed. The boss was calling himself the Chalk Commander until we got to Bastion. Chalk is a term for about 30 blokes assigned to an aircraft. It dates back from World War II, when a platoon of powers would write its number in chalk on the side of an aircraft to help keep themselves and their kit together. In my mind, being in a chalk meant you might be jumping or fast roping out of an aircraft at some point. In reality, we were just a bunch of bootnecks, and only a couple of us were even parachute trained. I certainly wasn't. The sergeant in charge was a great bloke named Harry, and he could call himself whatever he liked, but chalk was for blackboards. Harry was from 40 Commando and knew me well. We had worked together in Air Defence Troop a few years earlier, when we were looking after the troop's vehicle fleet, including their 12 BV amphibious go-anywhere personnel carriers designed for the Arctic. They were weird little things, like 2 little mini tanks held together by a hydraulic ram to articulate them. It was later developed into the Viking, a bigger and better version that arrived in Afghan in 2006. The Vikings did such a hoofing job that the vehicles hadn't been allowed to return back to the UK, and they were still there when I arrived. The lads were beginning to discover there was only one flaw, that they were vulnerable to rolling under certain conditions. You did not want to be Top Gunner when that happened. Harry was a corporal when I worked with him, and a keen sportsman. He played football for the Marines and loved it. He got more time off than Rambo's safety catch to play football for the Corps. I didn't mind though, because I got to run things while he was away. At Kandahar, Harry pinged me to help him deal with the chalk's burgers and weapons, which the RAF ground crew had dumped in a pile outside the arrivals tent. As we sorted through, a light breeze blew and brought with it a cloud of air smelling of chemically treated, slowly rotting shit. "Fuck's sake, Harry! Have you dropped your guts, mate?" Not me, Rammers. That is the wonderful aroma of calf. It's the sewage treatment plant. When the wind's in the wrong direction, there ain't nothing you can do about it. The food here is so good, everyone stuffs their faces while they got the chance. What goes in must come out. What a smell. This place really was a shithole. We identified 40 Commando's kit and shifted it, getting the rifles secured to a pallet for the Hercules flight from Kandahar to Camp Bastion. The only weapons we had in transit were our personal rifles and attached SUSAT optical sights. They were packed 5 at a time into valises, soft containers that rolled up like a bedroll. Each valise was marked with the rifle's serial number and the names of the lads they belonged to. The SA-80 was introduced in the early 1980s, but these were very different weapons from the original. After years of problems, in 2000, the military handed the rifle to Heckler & Koch and told them to sort it out. Now, it's an excellent weapon, with a 30-round magazine and can fire a single shot or fully automatic. The addition of a 40mm grenade launcher turns a good rifle into a hoofing rifle. We also brought a light support weapon for each section. Basically, an SA-80 with a longer barrel and a bipod to steady it. It was meant to give a section of 8 blokes a load more punch, but the designers had forgotten some of the basics of infantry fighting. It comes with a 30-round mag, when what you really need is belt-fed firepower. You don't want to be messing around changing magazines every few bursts when you're trying to keep a load of enemies' heads down. We use the LSW as a marksman's weapon, out to about 600 metres, halfway between a standard and a sniper rifle. In the role that the LSW was meant to fill, we used a pretty tasty Belgian gun called the Mini-Me. It was the same 5.56mm calibre as our rifles, but was belt-fed, fully automatic, and could put down hundreds of rounds of suppressive fire in a few tenths of a second. My kind of weapon. There was no need to pack any ammunition. All you could ever use was in Afghan already. My bargain contained all my field kit and was packed and ready to go. All in all, it weighed around 40k. I'd also packed a laptop and a grip bag with my phys kit and a few luxuries, including a photo album with pictures of me and my daughter Kezia, Becky, and a few of my civvy mates, as well as my mum, dad, and sister. Whenever you put any piece of kit on the floor, it picked up a coating of clay dust so fine it was like talcum powder. Keeping kit clean and functional in this environment was going to be a nightmare. Harry and me bundled the bargains into a pile for the lads to collect and went to check in at RAF arrivals, a white fabric tent on a galvanised steel framework set on a concrete slab put down by the engineers. Hundreds of Marines and soldiers of all ranks in desert camouflage and civilians with blue body armour and helmets were crammed into this permanent marquee about the size of a tennis court. Inside there were trestle tables, strip lights, fizzy drink machines, stacks of water bottles piled up in cardboard boxes, and a set of check-in desks knocked together from some spare pallet timber. There were UK power points attached to the beams at floor level so you could charge up your phone, laptop, or whatever device you had that needed a boost. The formalities of British military personnel arriving in the Afghan desert were dealt with here. Slowly. I made myself a wet from an urn of hot water and looked at the bleary-eyed, pissed-off collection of men and women around me. It was the middle of the night. The smokers on the flight stood outside puffing away. Someone had rigged up a PowerPoint projector and was playing Pirates of the Caribbean from their laptop. I was happy to just chill out and watch the movie while the RAF movers got their act together and processed us through. Everything was pretty chilled. It didn't feel like a war zone at all. The chances of getting hurt seemed about as real as Johnny Depp's overly dramatic sword fight with Orlando Bloom that I had just had the pleasure of watching. After about 2 hours, they had checked our passports and recorded our arrival in theatre. They processed us through, and it was back on the shitty bus to the Hercules heading for Camp Bastion. The 4 massive 6-bladed propellers of the C-130 were already tearing away at the air as we marched into the cargo area from the back of the aircraft, walking up the tail ramp against a prop wash nearly strong enough to blast you off your feet. It was unbelievably noisy inside, and the Lodi pointed us towards our nylon webbing seats slung between aluminium poles down both sides of the aircraft. More seats were set up back to back along the centre line, and we all piled in, clipping into the seatbelts as the Lodis heaved the massive pallet of guns and bargains into the cargo space at the rear and chained it all down. Then they passed around a cardboard bucket filled with yellow foam earplugs, which were welcomed as the engine sounded like 100 giant pneumatic drills all screaming at once. You could barely make out someone shouting at full volume an inch from your ear. The pilots taxied us out as the Lodis closed the tail ramp. It was pitch black outside and we couldn't see a thing. The aircraft interior glowed red with specialised lighting to protect our night vision. We all tipped sideways as the pilot lined up on the runway and hit the brakes before piling on full power. The turboprops screamed as they ripped the air at full whack, and we were away. The pilots performed a tactical landing at Bastion, dropping out of the sky at the steepest angle possible, and we got down about a minute ahead of our guts. The Lodis hate clearing up vomit and get upset if any of their passengers fail to puke in their own helmet. They don't exactly make their own lives easy though. Their favourite trick on anyone looking a bit airsick is to pass around a sick bag containing the cold contents of a tin of vegetable soup. Nice. The Herc taxied towards a collection of shipping containers at the end of a gravel runway at Camp Bastion. These, and a couple of Thunderbox toilets out in the desert, were what passed for the arrivals hall. It took me a while to realise the whole airstrip and welcoming Thunderboxes were inside the perimeter. The base was massive. It wasn't so much a camp as it was a tent pod town with fortifications like something out of Mad Max, but on a much bigger scale. Its Heskel perimeter was more than 20 miles long. We climbed into the back of a 4-ton truck, which ground its way along a compacted sand road. The camp contained everything a frontline soldier in Afghanistan could ever need, and it felt safer to me than Plymouth on a Saturday night. Massive rubberized bladders, 20 and 40 feet square, containing aviation fuel, diesel, petrol, and water, were everywhere. The engineers had sunk 7 borehole wells to feed water to the camp. There was a firing range inside the perimeter, air-conditioned tented gyms, a replica Taliban compound for incoming troops to practice assault in, hundreds of hot showers and comfy toilets, a field hospital, dining halls, and beds for around 2,500 troops. There were vehicle workshops, a fixed-wing runway, and a separate heliport with maintenance hangars for the Apache attack helos and the fleet of Chinooks. A HQ compound directed the tactical fight against the Taliban and resupply of frontline call signs across Helmand province, an area about 3 times the size of Wales. The camp even had its own sewage farm, just like Kandahar. It didn't smell quite as bad, but then the food wasn't quite as good either. Dotted along the perimeter were watchtowers made from shipping containers the engineers had stacked up like giant Lego bricks. You could see all the way to the horizon, and there wasn't an ounce of cover. Not a bush or a dip in the ground as far as you could see. It was so flat and barren that it was a bit like looking out to sea. The location was chosen by the Afghans, whose tactical use of the terrain was second to none. Bastion's location, miles from anywhere in the middle of a flat piece of desert, made it an almost impossible target to attack. Taliban mortar teams just couldn't get close. It felt safe. And it must have been. Gordon Brown visited the camp, numerous celebrities did morale visits, and the Top Gear crew even filmed an episode there. The flight from Kandahar had only taken about an hour or so, but it was around 2 a.m. when we got to the transit accommodation. The excitement at arriving in country had worn right off by the time we walked into that giant hangar filled with hundreds of empty bunk beds. We piled our kit onto the lower bunks, unrolled our slugs onto the bare mattresses, used our body armour as pillows, and were asleep almost instantly. The rifles crackled as we zeroed the sights on the range. We were shooting targets 100 metres away in a 10-lane range marked out in the desert just inside Bastion's perimeter. I drew 10 rounds in a clip from 2 of the range staff in the back of a Land Rover and bombed up my magazine. I attached a speed loader to the top and inserted the clip, pressing my thumb on top of the rounds until they zipped neatly into the magazine. When we were fighting, every 5th round would be tracer. For now, it was plain 5.56 standard NATO ball ammunition. I lay prone on the bun line, propped up on my elbows, and levelled my rifle at the target. I flicked the fire selector lever on the left-hand side of the butt to semi-automatic for a single shot, and pushed the safety catch crossbar above the trigger from safe to off. Pressing my cheek to the nylon pad on the stock, I looked through the SUSAT. The sight uses a single crosshair running from the 6 o'clock position and terminating in a needle point at the centre. I looked at the target. A black and brown image of a soldier from the waist up, helmet and rifle visible, magnified 4 times in the SUSAT. I consciously relaxed as I placed the tip of the point over a box on the target that indicated the centre of mass. Then, I breathed out slowly and squeezed the trigger. A tenth of a second later, sand splashed behind the target as the lead slug passed through it at around 2,000 miles per hour and buried itself into the berm directly behind. The scalding hot spent brass cartridge ejected to my right and hit the deck a fraction of a second later. If you want an idea of how hot the cartridge is on ejection, there's a pretty funny video posted online of some army lads in the middle of a big contact, fighting from the back of a Bulldog armoured vehicle in Iraq. 2 of them are standing side by side putting down the rounds, and the bloke on the left's cartridge ejects straight down the back of his buddy's body armour. The bloke yells like he's been shot and jiggles around as the red hot casing gets stuck between his skin and the ceramic plate. I could see I'd hit the target, but I wasn't sure where. I repeated the process, taking 4 more shots. Rounds complete. All 10 of us walked up to the targets to see how we had done. My shots were nicely grouped, about 8 inches to the right and 2 inches high of the aiming point. The instructor took a look. Try 3 clicks left and 1 down, he said. I took my combi tool out and adjusted the SUSAT as instructed. 5 more rounds, all on target. Tighten up the sight, lock in the adjustment. Each shot had hit the centre of the target within a space about the size of a man's fist. It wasn't to the standard of a marksman, but it was good enough for me. 1 individual weapon ready for anything. 1 individual ready to put his feet up at the naffy with a magazine and a cold can of Coke. We spent most of that first day in a hangar, taking lectures and briefings from various army officers to bring us up to speed on what was happening. We got an intelligence briefing setting out the latest tactics being used by the Taliban and covering recent activity around Helmand province, the area under British control in southern Afghanistan. It was the Taliban's heartland. Many of the people lived in isolated rural communities that, apart from the introduction of a tatty little motorbike and AK-47s, hadn't changed for 1,000 years. They rested up in homes made from mud bricks, held together with mud mortar, and finished with mud render. Electricity, when there was any, was used mainly for irrigating the opium poppies. The Helmand River flows down through the mountains around Sangin and out onto the desert plain at Gereshk. It passes through the capital Lashkargah and onto Garmasiya towards Pakistan in the south, before taking a sharp right turn towards Iran in the west. The green zone of farmland around the Helmand River was some of the most fertile in the country. Almost all of it was being used to grow opium poppy. It was tragic. In the 60s apparently, it was all wheat, barley, fruit trees, and almonds. The intelligence officers told us that it was fairly quiet around the province at that time because the population was busy planting that year's opium crop. We didn't know it then, but it was due to be a record harvest. The numbers made you think. About 200,000 farming families in Helmand would plant 103,500 hectares of poppy, an area about the size of Bedfordshire. This produced about 5 tons of raw opium and put $500 million in hard cash into the hands of the farmers. Each poppy farmer earned around $6,000 a year from his crops, about twice the average wage in Helmand province. You try telling them to grow wheat. The same farmer would have earned about $1,800. To the farmers, it was a no-brainer. The first planting was going in as we took the briefing. A second, fast-growing type would go into the ground in around late February or March the following year to avoid the coldest part of the winter. Both types would be ready for a harvest about a month after the end of our tour in May. Nearly 2/3 of the heroin on the streets of Britain came from Helmand, we were told. The opium was refined in factories on the border with Pakistan and trafficked to the west. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out how they fund insurgency. Opium goes out of Helmand and back come newly recruited foreign fighters, weapons and US dollars. Each harvest earns the Taliban around £200 million. I wanted to know why we didn't just torch the whole lot of it. The Taliban would be skint and out of business overnight. It turned out to be a lot more complicated than that, but that's why I'm a bootneck and not a diplomat. If the Brits eradicated the crop, they would put hundreds of Afghan farmers out of work and take $500 million out of the pockets of the locals. Those people were just trying to earn a living. If you burn down the crops that they had busted their asses to put in, then they were going to get mad. Real mad. And the Afghans believe in vengeance. It's unmanly and shames your whole family to leave a blow unavenged. Fighting was the Afghan national sport. Trashing the opium would be the best recruiting tool the Taliban ever had. That was the theory anyway, so we were going to leave the poppy alone. Some sections on patrol left kilos of unrefined opium worth hundreds of thousands of pounds in rural Afghan compounds untouched so as not to upset the locals. The strategy was to target the big boys and take down the factories where possible. For new Taliban arrivals just off the bus from Pakistan, Chechnya, Bradford, Birmingham or wherever, Garmsea district down south was the first chance to test themselves against British forces. Our lads down there at Fob Delhi were manning the front line along the high street of Garmsea's main market town, Darvasham, like a scene from World War I. A string of checkpoints along the street controlled a no man's land stretching about 1,000 metres to the south. From here, the lads could call down their 105mm artillery, 81mm mortars and airstrikes onto Taliban positions. The area was riddled with Taliban trench systems and bunkers. The town is a major crossing point on the Helmand River and stop-off point on the route from Lashkar to Pakistan. Any Taliban who survived the fight down south came on to Sangin to have a crack at us at their other mountain strongholds, Musa Qala, Nowzad and Kajaki. At Kajaki, the job was to keep the hydroelectric dam producing electricity for the people of Helmand. The Taliban were determined to turn out the lights. To be honest, I didn't think much about the Taliban or what motivated them. I did know, however, that they killed teachers on sight because they didn't want anybody to know anything about the modern world. They'll teach their blokes to strip an AK-47 blindfolded, ride a motorbike and fight. But that's it. They particularly hated girls being educated and would even come after families who sent their daughters to school. Before British forces arrived, teachers got warnings called night letters. A notice from the local Taliban commander would be pinned to the door in the middle of the night, warning that if they continued teaching, then they would be executed. One teacher in Lashkar told an army colonel the story about a brave friend of his who ignored the night letters. The Afghan teacher was at his dad's funeral when the Taliban came for him. As he lowered his dad's coffin into its grave, they shot him in the back of the head and threw him on top. The teacher who told that story was a fully qualified headmaster. After seeing that done, he gave up and started to grow opium poppy for a living just like everyone else. In a village down near Darvisham, a troop from 4-5 Commando were patrolling through and chatting to the locals when a teacher popped out of the woods looking like Ben Gunn. He was wearing a loincloth and flip-flops and had a beard down to his bollocks. He must have weighed all of 6 stone soaking wet. The bloke had been living rough in the tree line because if the Taliban saw him, then they were going to kill him. He'd seen the lads' patrol go in and knew it'd be safe for him to enter the village to see a couple of his mates. He was jabbering away to people like he hadn't seen anyone for months. The village was a moderate one by local standards, and the locals used to hide little bowls of food for him out in the fields, even though by doing so they were risking the lives of every member of their community. That was how badly the Taliban wanted teachers dead. During my tour, there was only one girls' school in Helmand, in Lashkargah. It had more than 7,000 pupils. That's how badly the local Afghans wanted their daughters to go to school. If British forces left, the school would have shut down the same day and the teachers gone into hiding. I've got a little girl. Imagine a place where people want to kill you for sending your daughter to school. The officers were clear enough as to why we were in Afghan. Helmand province was the Taliban's backyard and the cradle of the 9/11 attacks. Our job was to deny a safe haven to terrorists that posed a threat to the people of the United Kingdom. Personally, I was there to do a job and to test myself. If I did any fighting, it would be for myself and for the lads to the left and right of me. Taking on the terrorists was fine by me. And if being there meant that a group of young girls got to go to school for a bit, then I was happy. We also got more updates on procedures and drills. There were talks on the IED threat, which is military jargon for landmines. Car bombs are tagged VB IEDs for Vehicle-Borne Improvised Explosive Device. They talked us through mine clearance drills and mine awareness exercises, IED types, where and when to expect Taliban to be digging them in, and the relevant drills to counter them. The Taliban often placed IEDs at pinch points on a patrol route, or used their knowledge of the terrain to predict where soldiers were likely to take cover or choose positions to go firm in. Then, they dug in the IEDs, usually with a combination of pressure plate plus control wire or radio controlled detonation systems that they used to trigger them. Looking back, I think I must have fell asleep during that lecture. The second night they moved us into a pod, a nice air-conditioned tent with electric lighting, power points, and 8 aluminium frame camp beds with plenty of space for all our kit. The floor was black plastic decking on graded hardcore. The tent was one of thousands in Bastion and surrounded by a single level of HESCO to protect from shrapnel. Not too far away was a nice naffy with a bar, pool table, and plasma TV screen. There was a shop next door selling lads mags and a good selection of luxuries like toiletries, cigarettes, and fizzy drinks. Across the camp were purpose-built shipping containers converted into ablution blocks. They were painted olive green and had shower cubicles, toilets, and sinks pre-installed. The engineers just had to hook up the water, power, and drainage, and they were good to go. There were hundreds of them lined up in rows, some reserved for particular units, some for officers, and some for anyone needing them. You got a good blast of hot water in the shower that never seemed to run out. Not so 4-star were the Thunderbox toilets, which were basically just a plastic cubicle with a seat over an oil drum or integral reinforced plastic tank. They were honking and smelt worse the warmer it got. One of the lads got caught short and had to use one right opposite the Bastion HQ compound. He cleaned it up as best he could before sitting down. When he looked up, he saw the words, "Welcome to Old Trafford," scrawled on the back of the door 2 inches from his face. Even in October, it was roasting hot, and the air was as dry as dust. After a day sweating about the camp and a nice hot shower, I found my skin getting itchy. Now, Royal Marines pride themselves on being educated infantry, and we know that real men aren't afraid to moisturise. So it was straight to the naffy for a tube of cocoa butter, which I slapped on every night. I even got the lads to do my back for me. We were in Bastion for 3 days, and the 40-odd blokes from 40 Commando were mostly in transit to frontline positions, so we weren't required to do any work. It was different for my mate Harry. He was going to be doing his whole tour at Bastion, fixing up computers and doing IT around the base. He was going to be so bored it wasn't even worth thinking about. I wouldn't have traded places with him for anything. Unlike us, he was working his nuts off from day one. Motor Transport Troop at Bastion were in their own little world, and none of them bothered me, which suited me fine. We just went to the gym and kept on top of our fizz, took showers, ate food, and chilled out in the sun, sipping coffee or cokes outside the naffy. After 3 days, word came through. Transfer to Fob Rob was to be by Chinook the next morning. A corporal was coming to pick us up in a 4-tonner at 1100 hours. Hoofing, I thought. This is it.